Welcome to a very special event designed and sponsored by the ANS, a half-hour interview with a neurosurgical luminary, Roberto Cosme Heros. Today is December 2nd, 2021. I'm Jacques Morcos, professor and co-chair of neurosurgery at the University of Miami, where I have been since 1995. I have known Roberto since 1989. And except for a hiatus for my 2 fellowships, I have been with him ever since. Throughout this half hour, I will help you, the audience, scratch the surface of who this man is, what he stands for, and why he is beloved and respected the world over as a master neurosurgeon and human being. Before I start interviewing Roberto, I'd like to read to you what I have written about him not too long ago, earlier this year, for the audience who does not know him. Maybe that give you a glimpse of the man, and then we'll hear, of course, from the man himself. As a fighting patriot, Dr. Roberto Heros braved his tumultuous world at the age of 18 with uncommon courage, grit, and conviction. He then conquered academic cerebrovascular neurosurgery with talent and determination and achieved surgical mastery to international acclaim. He carries his heart on his sleeve every day of his life. Born with supreme integrity, he never lost it, not through fame nor disappointments. A charismatic leader, he is the moral compass to each and all in our field. His heart is pure, his vision crystal clear, his soul untarnished by what depraves most men. He is the educator of all educators. His knowledge is vast, and his compulsion to share it for the betterment of patients is a blessing to all. He teaches like we breathe. His love of and loyalty to trainees is indomitable. Courage and valor, honesty and humility are to him self-evident, yet to the rest of us barely attainable. His example is a shining beacon, and his legacy is monumental, as you will see. He was my teacher, became my mentor, then partner, and then friend. Then again, Roberto is really my big brother to whom I owe more than I can tell. And I promise you that will be the end of my own monologues for this interview.
And who were you talking about?
I was talking
can't recognize that person.
So Roberto, I don't need to tell you what a pleasure it is to have you here. So I am going to get going with the first question to you. Is most neurosurgeons' transition from high school to college was likely celebrated with champagne, parties, leisure trips. You, on the other hand, chose to do it by waging a war to defend what you believed in Cuba. Tell us what it meant to you growing up in Cuba in the 40s and 50s, living through the communist Castro takeover, and then fighting as a paratrooper in, of course, the ill-fated Bay of Pigs.
Well, you know, Cuba was a magnificent place in the 40s and the 50s. It was prosperous. My life was happy. I just had a blessed childhood and early adolescence. And until the day the world changed, is the way and I got that sentence from, that's not my words, but I read it in a book, the day the world changed. And it did change for me. It changed dramatically when Fidel Castro's revolution won and Fidel came to Cuba. I had a grandfather that was an intellectual, was really a very special person, spoke 6, 7 languages and understood things in a way that is almost unbelievable. He could tell that these people were communists. He could tell the minute he saw them wearing their rosaries with a cross, he said, you know, that's to deceive us. These people are real communists. Now, my grandfather had read, you know, a lot of literature about communism, and he then made me read about communism. Even Mao's little red book. And so I, you know, as I said, my life changed immediately. I became, life was not fun anymore. It became serious. And the defining day for me was actually a day that my father was director of a children's hospital. He was a pediatrician, and he was director of a children's hospital. He spent his mornings there. He really enjoyed that job. And it actually cost him money because he had to leave much of his practice, go to his practice in the afternoon, so he was losing money, but he loved that job. And then a group of 4 or 5 milicianos, people with Castro, with the shaggy beards, dirty people, with their little machine guns, came in to his office, and I happened to be there, and say, well, let's see how much you stole. Let's see. Of course, I found nothing, but my father was a very peaceful, very lovely gentleman. I was not. I was a kind of a violent little big kid, and I felt that it was my duty to defend my father, and yet I did not. I was afraid of those. I did nothing and said nothing. And I then felt so bad and so guilty about not having taken up for my father and defending him that I just lost all sense of humor. If anybody talked to me about the revolution, in favor of the revolution, they had a fight in their hands. And so finally my friends convinced my father that I had to leave the country after one of those brawls with a pro-Castro individual, and hurt pretty badly. And the next morning I was out of Cuba. And then eventually I heard of the invasion, people being recruited to go and fight in Cuba. And of course I had no choice but to do that, I thought. So I did, and I've never been sorry that I did. I'm sorry we lost.
That's right, that's right.
Very sorry.
And you've told me before, and maybe you can briefly tell us, because most of your compatriots, the Cubans, I guess, blamed JFK, John F. Kennedy, for the bad outcome. What are your views on that? I know you have some views.
Well, I differ in that sense. I didn't, to be honest, 18 years old, I'm just a kid, and I thought that I could get hurt or killed, but I never thought we could lose. And but the reason I thought we couldn't lose is because I was sure that the Cuban people were going to help us and turn against Castro. So all I wanted from the United States is the opportunity to go there. I wanted, I was a paratrooper, I wanted a parachute that opened, and in fact mine did open, and a plane to get me there, and a weapon that worked. So that's what I wanted from the United States. So I have no right, I never felt that I had the right then to criticize Kennedy because he didn't give us air support and so forth, which indeed was part of the plan. He canceled it at the end, and that's why many Cubans resent Kennedy, because he changed the plans and canceled air support and so forth. But at that time, Kennedy was very young, a lot younger than we are now. Of course, he was early 40s, no experience, no executive experience, had just taken over the presidency. And at that time, we were very scared of Russia. The Russians had the Soviets had just put a satellite, and then a satellite with a monkey, and then a satellite with a person, before we could even do any of that. So we were intimidated by the technology in Russia. So what conversations Kennedy had with Khrushchev at that time, what threats did Khrushchev say, well, okay, if you do this, if you go ahead with invasion, because at that time it was obvious that this was going to happen, then we are going to invade West Berlin. And so only Kennedy knows what was on his mind, and he had a big responsibility for a big country, not just a bunch of Cubans that wanted to go and recover their country.
Now, of course, you went to prison for about, 20 months, was it? Or
20 months.
20 months. I mean, I've heard your stories, and I mean, we can spend 2-3 hours listening just to that experience, but I want our audience to hear more of the neurosurgeon later on. But one of the remarkable qualities you possess is this really unshakable loyalty you have to the things that you are passionate about. So I do want to hear again, express your sentiments about what this great country, the USA, means to you.
Yeah, well, I will try to say something about that with dry eyes. My eyes get wet still, when my son laughs at me, says, Dad, you're getting senile now. Babies cry and old people cry, and you cry, when I hear the national anthem and see the flag Even when I see the good guys in a movie win, if they're American soldiers winning, even though I know they won, they still get very. So with dry eyes now, I will try to tell you that there is no country like this country. I mean, you know, we fought world wars and won them, and what did we do? We gave them back, reconstructed the countries that we defeated. No country has done that. And then what this country has done for people like myself, refugees that have come into this country, that this country had no reason to be specially helpful. I can tell you that I was not treated like an ordinary American citizen. I was treated better. I was given things and privileges that American-born people did not have. When I got here, you know, what can I tell you? I went to the story. I went to Memphis, Tennessee.
Yeah.
I went to Memphis because I had come to Miami, and it was really a party atmosphere here. Everywhere I went, oh, you were on the Bay of Pigs. Somebody wanted to pay the bill and for my dinner, and I said, look, this is not conducive to. I got to get on here, get on with life, make a living. Hopefully, one of these days, study. So I had heard that I had some experience when I finished high school. I couldn't get into university right away, so I sold insurance, life insurance. And then I heard that there were about 18 or 20 doctors in Memphis. One had run the other and the other. And I said, good, they need life insurance. Let me go to Memphis. And I went to Memphis, sold life insurance for a year, saved enough money to go to school. And at that time, I can't believe the manager of the company, when I told him, I'm sorry, I'm going to go to school, he said, oh, but you're such a good salesman. What I didn't tell him is that I had run out of Cubans to sell life insurance. And I didn't know how to sell life insurance to anybody else but to the Cubans. So saved enough, and then unbelievably, I was given unbelievable privilege. I finished high school in Cuba. They called it bachillerato, baccalaureate. It's 5 years.
French, yes.
5 years. It's a little more advanced than the usual high schooling here. I had no papers, nothing. And I told this story to the Dean of Admissions at Southwestern University at that time, and now it's called Rhodes College. And then he said, well, what else do you do? I said, well, I play football. And actually, I was MVP the last year. Now, MVP in Cuba, playing American football, where there are 5 teams, is equivalent of a bad high school team here. Right. But they give me a scholarship to play football. I didn't even make the bench. I don't know of any other scholarship athlete that hasn't even been able to make the bench on the team. And then they continue my scholarship because I was making good grades. I had straight A's. And even though I didn't play football, I continued on a scholarship. Not only that, but I was given credit for 2 years of college in Cuba. I convinced them that some of the subjects I took, calculus, organic chemistry, and so forth, were college equivalent. So on my word, I was given credit for that. And then the Dean of Southwestern called the Dean of Admissions at the University of Tennessee, Memphis, and got me in medical school. So I didn't have to go through the applications of 20 different schools, and you know, who else has that privilege? So I love this country, and you know, one of the great frustrations that I will never get over is the fact that I really haven't repaid this country what this country has given me. I tried and failed, but the reason I failed is because I was doing it half-assed, so to speak. During the Vietnam War, I wanted to go to Vietnam and say, well, this would be a way to pay my dues. But then instead of just going as a regular soldier, I said, but let me go as a doctor to make sure I don't get shot, and I will go as a doctor. So then I took an extra year of surgery, so I could go not only as a doctor, but as a partially trained surgeon. End story, the war was winding down, and I was stationed in Columbus, Ohio, and I never got to go to Vietnam. So that's probably the last opportunity I had to really pay back to this country. And it's a great frustration that I haven't done it.
I'm not worried about you not paying back. You've trained so many U.S. neurosurgeons. I think you've paid more than your share of what, and this country, of course, is very honored to have you. And then, of course, you went on to Mass General, where you did your residency. I'm curious, and I'm sure many would love to hear, when did you get attracted to the field of cerebrovascular surgery, and perhaps how?
Well, neurosurgery, I did get attracted because I had an uncle that was a neurosurgeon, as you know, Dr. Picasa. But initially, actually, I was thinking about pediatric neurosurgery, and then it was my exposure to cerebrovascular surgery from Bob Ojiman, although he was not a intracranial cerebrovascular surgeon, but he was very interested in carotid endarterectomies. And then particularly the exposure to Dr. C. Miller Fisher, the famous neurologist, in my opinion, the best neurologist of his time, committed to stroke neurologists as well as being an extraordinary person, extraordinary neurologist that really said, this is what I want to do intellectually. Cerebrovascular surgery has always been very attractive to me.
Yeah. And as you know, I mean, I and many consider you one of the most effective neurosurgical educators and someone who embodies really the true meaning of what a mentor is. Talk to me about your own mentors, talking about C. Miller Fishers, any others, I mean, the neurosurgical giants.
Neurosurgical, it really, I would have to say Bob Ojiman was, and it's interesting, the reason that I consider him such an important mentor is that he was so different than me that I could never quite be like him. And yet I thought, this is the ideal neurosurgeon. And the reason I thought Bob Ojiman was the ideal neurosurgeon is very simple. His patients did well. He was exquisitely careful, boring at surgery, very slow, very boring, because he'll do every operation as if he were doing it for the first time, as if he took every precaution. And he was just boring. He was, later on when I was on the faculty at the Mass General, it was embarrassing because there would be visitors and Bob Ojiman would be operating on a room and I was operating in another room, and they gradually drifted from his room to mine because obviously what I did was, clip, the aneurysm is clip, it was very exciting. Bob Ojiman was slow, meticulous, but damn it, his patients did well. And I could never be that careful. I never had that patience. I was more, although to say more like him, who could be like him, but one of my indirect mentors was Charlie Drake. He was an impatient man, just like I am. He could never have the patience that you have. You're incredible. You can do cerebrovascular surgery and tumor surgery, which are very different. To do an acoustic requires infinite patience, which I don't have. So that at the end, when you're tired, this one is most difficult to save that facial nerve. And I remember seeing Drake. He was fantastic about. He had a fifth sense about that where the perforators were. But he would come, the residents had everything supposed, he put the clip and he left, and I said, wow, this is but he was, but in an acoustic, I could tell watching his operations, and then his disc, he made a disc with audio and everything, and I could, of every operation, and I'd sit there listening, and the 3 times that I visit him, watching his tapes, and I could tell when doing an acoustic that he would say, damn, this is difficult. I could just tell the facial nerve was about to go. And he said, damn, there went the facial. But I would ask questions, and he had the wisdom of experience. And the reason is that he remembered his complications. He'd remember every complication he had. And I would ask him a question and say, oh, well, I did that once, and I remember, he even remembered the name of the patient. Wow. And he remembered why he had the complication and was very free to talk about it and clearly learn from his complications. So I admired the man greatly, and I consider him an indirect mentor, even though I spent probably less than 6 weeks with him altogether, the 3 times I was there. of the direct mentors, the second one I mentioned, Bob Oshim, but clear, C. Miller Fisher was spectacular teacher. He had the Socratic method of teaching. I remember we both worked late, and the Massiena and I would be making rounds, and I would see him on the floor, and I was tempted to ask him a question. Then I look at my watch and say, damn, it's 9 o'clock. I better not ask him a question, because he would say, sit down, Roberto, sit down, let me ask you. So I remember one day he was, I was going to do I think it was a vertebral transposition for vertebrobasilar, for vertebral steel, subclavian steel. And Fisher knew that. Somebody told him. He said, oh, Roberto, I heard you're going to do this tomorrow. And I said, yeah. And he said, oh, and you're doing that to prevent a stroke, right? And I said, yes, of course, Dr. Fisher. And he said, and people with subclavian steel have strokes, is that right? And I said, yeah, of course, you know that. And then he'll bring the pen and a little book and say, can you give me the name of some of those patients with a stroke? Because I for 30 years I've been watching, I've never seen it happen. So, you know, took a long time to learn, but I've never forgotten that that subclavian steel doesn't really lead to stroke, but it took 15 minutes. But he was just, the way his confidence in the neurologic examination, in the way the nervous system worked. Like he would say, people say something and said, no, that's impossible. This is what this is, and the reason is. So it was, he was a wonderful mentor, and my inspiration for cerebrovascular surgery.
And you, of course, you visited Yazergil, you visited Vinko Doleng.
I could never, I just got bored both times and left a little earlier. That, I don't want him to hear that. But the problem is, he could, it's like watching Michelangelo paint. To watch Yazergil operate at that time, it was like watching Michelangelo paint. You don't go home and paint like Michelangelo. So yes, it was spectacular to see him operate, but I knew that I could never do things the way he did. So that wasn't as useful as visiting Drake and hearing his complications and so forth.
So again, let me summarize your academic journey as follows. You've spent 3 years as a young faculty, of course, in Pittsburgh with Janetta, went on 9 years at Mass General, then you became chair at University of Minnesota, and of course I benefited from that because you took me outside the match at the time. You were there for 6 years, and then of course came to Miami. We came together in 1995. You were co-chair here with Barth Green all those years. You've held continuous NIH funding for more than 15 years. Of course, everybody knows your seminal research on vasospasm, subarachnoid hemorrhage. You quoted, spearheaded the brain attack movement in the 90s. You've published, of course, numerous articles, which we'll touch upon shortly. But it's really fair to say, and I think I can say it for myself and many of my colleagues, that your supreme honesty in publishing those early complications you encountered as a young faculty, really, this is, many neurosurgeons are so thankful for that, because not only was it highly refreshing to have an honesty like this back in the 80s, not too many people were publishing their complications, but I'm just curious to know, was there any hesitation from your part as a young rising star, instead of publishing, oh, look how good I am, publishing your complications? Just take us a little bit through your process, which would lead into the papers.
No, I never had any hesitation. First of all, I had a lot of complications, and I thought it was a shame not to share them, because frankly, I forgot my successes. I mean, yeah, they make you feel good for a couple of days, but it's the complications that get to you, and you remember, and they stay with you. That's what, because you don't want to make them again. In fact, I remember not only my complications, but even the few that you have had, because I want to learn. I want to make sure that doesn't happen to me.
More than a few.
So yes, I thought for very early on that, I'm not a Yazergil type surgeon. I cannot show a video of my masterfulness in surgery, But I did have a lot of complications, and I thought sharing those with my colleagues was a contribution that I could make. And no, I never had any hesitation about it. I'm very glad I did.
Yeah, and I think you told me you would go to international meetings and neurosurgeons would stop you. Thank you, Dr. Heros, for publishing this and that.
Yeah. Well,
it saved me, correct?
That happened.
Yeah. Which I think leads me into, I mean, we're not going to go over your bibliography, but just tell me some of your favorite papers that you've written and perhaps some background behind each.
Well, I remember you talk about this paper. This is a simple little paper of a complication. This is a lady that I killed by carelessness. The lady that had a small aneurysm. I thought it was just a small paraclinoid aneurysm. I didn't pay attention to the fact that she had an isolated circulation on that side. The other carotid didn't, she didn't have an anterior communicating competent complex. And I didn't do what I always did for larger paraclinoid aneurysms, which is to expose the carotid on the neck. So I was there to drill the anterior clinoid, as we usually do, and the thing exploded. The aneurysm exploded, and then I had to pack it. I didn't have the carotid exposed. The bleeding stopped. Turns out that I occluded the carotid. She had a major stroke and died. And on looking at that case again, I noticed that there was something unusual about that aneurysm, and that is that it pointed, as opposed to the usual ophthalmic aneurysms, or the point towards the optic nerve, this pointed laterally, kind of, and then it had a flat shape on the top. And then I look at the CT scan, and this is what really hurt about that case, that I looked retrospectively at the CT scan, and if you looked at the bone windows, there was a hole on the anterior clinoid.
Eroded, yes.
So as I was drilling the anterior clinoid, I drilled right into the aneurysm.
I cannot imagine the
I've had 4 or 5 people stop me in a meeting and tell me, thank you for writing that paper, because I recognize this, and that patient I could have killed just like you did your patient if you hadn't written that. So I mean, what could give you more pleasure than that? And then I wrote, a paper about the far lateral approach, and that was a result of a conversation with Drake. Dr. Drake told me, I don't have a solution for aneurysms at the origin of the basilar artery. I try to do them transorally, and they all die of meningitis. At that time, of course, we didn't know how to. And so I came back and said, well, there must be a way to get at it by just going a little more lateral than the usual. So, I worked it out and wrote that paper, and that's being a very useful paper. Then I wrote about combining the terminal approach with what I call the pretemporal approach for basilar aneurysms. And what led to that were my bad results with the straight temporal approach, the subtemporal approach that Drake could do, but he had a way to know where those perforators on the other side were, and I didn't. I had a number of occlusions of the other perforator on the other side of the P1 because I couldn't see it. And of course the third nerve always, so I said, and then Jacques had used the terminal approach, but if you looked at his series, there were about 20% of the patients that he abandoned. He couldn't do because he couldn't see the perforators on the back. So I figured, well, there must be a way to do both, to be able to see from the front and to see behind, and that's what led to my writing about that combined approach. Then, of course, I looked up the late results of my initial series of AVMs, and I tell you, that was a shock, because when I looked at grade 5 AVMs, I operated some 50 or so, 40, 50 of them, half of those patients were wrecked. And it wasn't just after surgery, this was on the late results. 45%, 48% serious morbidity at 6 months. So I said, well, come on, we shouldn't be doing this. And I began to talk about not operating on those very high grade AVMs. And Bob Spetzer eventually came up to the same conclusion. But probably, and this is the last one I'm going to tell you, I think the most important paper I wrote was one that there was great hesitancy about publishing, because it's where I talk about different approaches where you resect a little bit of brain rather than work under the brain for deep lesions, paraventricular lesions, and so forth. And I can tell you that many neurosurgeons don't talk about that very often. They're very embarrassed because, you know, the brain is sacred. You never resect any brain. But I can tell you that probably many lives have been saved by people resecting a little bit of brain to, say, get with a swollen temporal lobe to get to the incisura, or to go to the atrium of the ventricle, you know, instead of using the transcerebral approach from the posterior temporal approach, to try to go like Jacques does, so she can do, but most mortals cannot, which is by going through the middle and then through the cuneus into, sometimes in patients where the brain is swollen, you can't open the sylvian fissure properly, just to go through the through superior temporal gyrus and get to the fissure medially, not trying to spread the tonsils on a distal pike aneurysm that's probably stuck to the tonsils, but just works through the tonsil to get to the aneurysm. Just a series of little things like that I suspect have helped many neurosurgeons, although most neurosurgeons don't like to recognize that they did that.
Yeah, and of course you have many other contributions, but yeah, those are certainly memorable. Moving on, Roberto, to organized neurosurgery. Of course, you've had numerous leadership positions. You were president of ANS, you were vice president of CNS, president of the American Academy of Neurosurgery, president of the WFNS Congress, where I was delighted to be your scientific committee chair, and many other positions you've had. Why should young neurosurgeons get involved in organized neurosurgery?
Well, first of all, it's fun. I mean, it's one way, from the practical point of view, it allows us a fair amount of free traveling, so to speak, that you can charge to the department. You meet great colleagues from not only around the country, from around the world. Some of my best friends in neurosurgery have come through my involvement with organized neurosurgery. And also it's kind of fun to have a little bit of executive responsibility as you assume these positions of responsibility with the national organizations, because we don't have much opportunity unless you're chairman of a department, to have true executive function to talk about money and budgets and so forth. So for me, it's been, it's been one of the most fun and rewarding parts of my career.
Now, maybe my last question, given the time constraint, Roberto, your clinical activities, of course, have gradually diminished naturally as you are nearing the wise old age of 80. Next September, you will turn 80. How are you handling retirement, even though you're really not retired, but I'll let you define what state you are in now. Is there another lesson in it to teach other neurosurgeons?
Well, I think that if you don't have a hobby, and there are about 4 hobbies only that really are worthwhile, and I have none of them. You could be a golfer. That's, leads to a good retirement in a golfer community. Or you could be a fly fisherman, make little flies and fish. A lot of people have been very happy in retirement doing that. Or a sailor. What else? A fisherman. I don't do any of those things. So for me, the solution was to not retire and to continue to work. The only thing I can do now is to be an administrator, to put, they actually pay me more than they should for doing a job that I don't know much about.
Don't worry, we're going to edit this piece off.
As an administrator, a chief medical officer in the hospital, you leave off hiring because of my track record in neurosurgery, which has nothing to do with what I'm doing now, but it keeps me occupied. But I think what's really made, so there are 2 things. That's retirement, that's what I was talking about. But the most difficult thing is not doing surgery. I love doing surgery, and I miss it tremendously. But one of the things that makes it tolerable not to be doing surgery, to be honest, is to have somebody like you to look at in the operating room and to see the way you do things and to realize that you can do most things much better than I could do them when I was doing them. And the pleasure of knowing that your legacy goes on, that it doesn't finish with you, that, that somebody else is starting where you left off and going higher. And to be able to have them in your same institution, and I would have had a very hard time retiring if I hadn't left a legacy of people like you, Jacques.
Well, me and many more, not just me. There are many around the world, as you well know.
Many more, but
Yeah.
you are, as you know, you are special. And it's nothing better for a teacher than to know, for a mentor, if you want to say that, know that a mentee has far surpassed you, and that's a dream, I think, of every good mentor.
Roberto, I thank you so much for this interview, which I'm sure everybody will enjoy, and of course we can perhaps do many more hours in future episodes. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jacques. And thank you for your wonderful comments and on this earth.
Thank you.
Thank you.